Welcome to New York Kurdish Cultural Center's Kurdish Heritage Celebration Talk Series. My name is Yüksel Serindag and a member of the New York Kurdish Cultural Center. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Michael Erdman, head of the Middle Eastern and Central Asian collections at the British Library. Today, we will be talking about the Kurdish children's literature books from the Soviet Armenia housed in the British Library. As a librarian, I find incredibly exciting and to discover and explore written Kurdish collections in curated materials at institutions like British Library, regardless of their size. I think each edition represents a vital contribution to preserving and understanding Kurdish literary and cultural heritage. My first question would be, how did you come across that, and how did you start creating these materials, and then also who donated these materials to the British Library?
Well, thank you, Yüksel. It's a great pleasure to chat with you today, to join everyone from the center as well. And although my role at the library is not exclusively dealing with Kurdish material, the Kurdish material is one of the joys I find of really being able to get into the types of holdings we have and the diversity of different materials. The children's books from Soviet Armenia and more broadly speaking, the Armenian materials rather the Kurdish materials from Armenia are a really fascinating part of the collection that show how some of the histories of what we have speak to very particular cultural dynamics. So we prior to the 1990s, so from about the 1960s to the 1990s, we had a program of exchange with the national libraries in the Soviet Union, where we would create a curated selection of materials that would reflect really publishing in the United Kingdom. And we would have 15 sets or 16 sets of these and send one to each of the national libraries in the Soviet republics. And those national libraries would in turn send materials to us. Because the Armenian SSR had Kurdish as an official language, as a minority language, they would include in their materials that they selected Kurdish language books that they would send to us to show as an example of some of the publishing in the country. And so we acquired a small but nonetheless important collection of Kurdish language materials for Kurds in Soviet Armenia, as well as the smaller communities in Soviet Georgia and Soviet Azerbaijan, and of course those Kurds who had moved to the larger cities like Leningrad and Moscow. And this gradually grew over especially the 1960s and 1970s, until the economic crises of the 1980s meant that we didn't necessarily receive the same number of minority language materials. So these are an example of an exchange. Of course, we have other Kurdish materials that are donated or were purchased, but they really are an emphasis on the Soviet Union's minority promotion of minority cultures policies, and particularly the promotion of Kurdish language and literature at a time when it was not the case in many of the regions in the south, east, and west of Kurdistan.
So that means what you said, the British Library has also other Kurdish materials, right?
Yes.
And they're not together, or is that you have created only these children's books? Am I correct, or is that?
So we have a collection of about 1,600 books in Kurdish and about 10 manuscripts in Kurdish. And they're from all across Kurdistan, all across the diaspora, and they're both children's and adults materials as well.
So why did you specifically select these children's books from just from this Kurdish collection to curate, what what is the most important element in that? When I read the website, the blog, it just reminded me of the Kurdish fairy tales, okay, with animal characters. It's very rich. It's very rich. Like then it reminded me of Aesop's fables, okay. And then when I saw these materials, it was fascinating to see how the animals are present in the Kurdish fairy tales, and also were printed in Soviet Armenia. Okay, so that's fascinating to me. Nothing else, but I mean, most of them are the stories, Kurdish fairy tales.
So perhaps I'll bring up the blog
Yeah.
post now, um, so that we can see. So you have this is the blog post. Unfortunately, one of the covers of Sherichev Kul, or the greedy lion,
Mm.
uh, is broken at the moment. But here you can start to see um, some of the works and some of the imagery as well that went along with the works. And if I can come down just um, to come to Gezgesk. So, looking at some of the animals that you mentioned, sort of personified on the cover, but then also to settle on some of the different aspects that I think these books are really interesting because they draw out so many different aspects of Kurdish culture and publishing and cultural production and studies in Soviet Armenia. So one is that the books are probably split between materials that were translated from Russian and occasionally from Armenian into Kurmanji,
Mm.
and those works that were original Kurdish works, usually fairy tales, folk tales, popular literature that's then standardized and published. Um, the latter were things that every minority group in the Soviet Union was exposed to. So in the 1930s, under Stalin, the policies of the Leninist policies of really trying to encourage independent, autonomous cultural growth were shelved, and the central government in Moscow took the Russians and their culture as being the leaders of the culture of the Soviet Union. And that meant that Russian works and many very classic Russian works were translated into other languages and used as a way to encourage socioeconomic growth amongst Kurds, Armenians, Azeris, Kazakhs, Chuvash, Tatars, the whole gamut of different ethnicities. And so some of those, of course, will have animals, others will have sort of humans, and a lot of them have heroes that sort of exemplify the values of the Soviet Union. But the other side is that in the 1920s, a large number of Kurdish-speaking Yazidis, particularly
Yeah.
from Anatolia, from Mesopotamia, migrated to Soviet Armenia. And they became very much involved in the establishment of Kurdish studies. They worked in Radio Erivan, so Radyoye Eriwane, the sort of flagship Soviet Armenian Kurdish radio station that broadcast to all of Kurdistan. And they really began to produce works to encourage the growth of Kurdish culture and to encourage literacy in Kurdish amongst children. In the 1930s, a great repression sort of took hold, especially in 1934. And many of the people were deemed to be politically too sensitive to publish adult works. But publishing for children was a bit less controversial. And so if you had things with animals, if you explained it in a very, like with Aesop, in an allegorical way, you could sometimes get around the censor, and you could sometimes really be able to instill a certain, ideological value or cultural value without necessarily being caught out by the center and being banned or deported or God forbid, murdered. So they really do reflect this attempt to, in some ways, sweeten and create literature that could evade the worst of Sovietization, and also really provide an outlet for many of these migrant Kurdish intellectuals who became very much involved. People like Hacı Cindi, like Evdal, like Jalil, who became ethnographers, who became anthropologists, and really worked with Kurdish folklore and folk literature. And so they then recycled it into these texts for children, which could have some values that were towards the idea of preserving a Kurdish cultural identity, but that didn't step on the toes of the censor because they were really just about animals.
Yeah, I when I read about Emine Evdal, I was not familiar with Emine Evdal. It's quite interesting. He wrote many books and also articles, and one of I think he wrote his dissertation about um uh women in the traditional rural areas of Kurdish families. Okay, this is way back when. So in early 30s or 40s, I forgot now when he wrote his dissertation. He wrote about women's role in in in Kurdish families. That's quite fascinating. And then I am familiar with Jalil Jalil. He was a professor, right?
Yes.
Professor of yeah. But then when I was growing up, we had a Kurdish bookstore in my hometown. Um, there was a novel in the bookstore. Okay, so by Arab Shamo, and the book was about the title of the book was Shivani Kurd, the Kurdish shepherd. So I vividly remember that title. Okay, so um, how? But the have you come across anything about the Kurdish autonomous region, autonomous republic, not independent but autonomous entity in Soviet Armenia or between Soviet Armenia and Soviet Azerbaijan, right? It was called Red Kurdistan.
So many of these people were a sort of almost eschewed politics. Some of them did become involved in the Soviet political parties, like
Yeah.
the centralized Bolsheviks. But they didn't necessarily become involved in Red Kurdistan. They didn't become involved in external Kurdish politics in the sense of Kurdish politics outside of the Soviet Union. Um, and Şivane Kurdo, Erib Shemo's novel is really quite an interesting one. I unfortunately have not read it in Kurdish. I've read it in Turkish translation.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
but I think the novel gives a sense of why many of these people did not become involved in the politics of establishing a Kurdish autonomous region in the same way, because it was such a traumatic experience of the movement of people across borders and the traumatic experience of losing a lifestyle, and um, the attempts in the late 1940s to establish an autonomous Kurdish republic that was Soviet in nature, or at least socialist leaning in nature, of course, ended quite badly for those who were involved in the affair. And they could go to the Soviet Union, but then, of course, even in the Soviet Union, they didn't necessarily have the same level of freedom and expression. And the people who were involved in the project of establishing a Kurdish Armenian or a Caucasian Kurdish identity and language, obviously were very reticent to become involved in anything that would endanger that project as well.
It's when you mentioned Radio Erivan, um, I when I was a child, even as a young man in my pre-teenage years, we would listen to Radio Erivan every evening at 7 p.m. So we would mostly, I mean, the reception was the best in the mountains, okay? And everyone at 7 p.m. would listen to Radio Erivan. It was half an hour, 45 minutes. I don't remember exactly how long it was, but it was just enormous, had an enormous impact on the Kurdish identity and Kurdish culture. So, and I mean, the artists such as, I mean, singers, Kawi Saga and Meyram Khan and Kharabati Khacho, we would listen to these people, okay? So it was a great, somehow we did not forget our Kurdish culture through Radio Erivan, okay? So that was fascinating in a way. Now, when you say uh, the Soviet Armenia played a unique role in publishing Kurdish language materials. How did the Soviet policies influence the Kurdish literary landscape and compared to other regions where Kurds live? For example, when I was growing up, we had songs that was influenced by the Soviet ideology. In those songs, we would sing Lenin and Stalin as our leaders. Okay, I mean, it was changed, but the names Lenin and Stalin were incorporated in those songs. Okay, so and I think one of the songs was from Soviet Kurds.
I think, at a time, it's really fascinating to see how this history in some way of how much Soviet Kurdish culture and creatives were so influential. It has in some ways dissipated a bit. But I'm going to just go on to sharing um, another just a snapshot of a some of the other titles here in terms of some of the books. So here you have a few other examples from the 1960s, 50s, really, up through the 1970s. Karline Chachani is one such author. You have a few other examples of authors who have worked with Kurdish works. But I think the way in which the Soviet system really encouraged Soviet Kurds to become a core component of cultural preservation and growth was starting here. You have in the 1930s. I'm sure we'll talk later on about all of the different alphabets.
Yeah.
But first, trying to produce works that were about literacy and encouraging literary production in Kurdish, or at least the use of literature in Kurdish. So the Soviets gave birth to an industry of publishing in Kurdish, and often translated, as you can see here, tercüme, so translated from other languages, usually Armenian or from Russian. And that meant that there could be a system of standardization of how texts were produced and how they were described, going in from 1933, then going into, as you can see, into the post-war period, where this becomes just a general process of reproduction of texts. So it allows for an industry long-term to establish, and that means editors are able to perfect their craft. Authors are able to perfect their craft. Cover designers can perfect their craft. Teachers and readers can really become far more attuned to the way Kurdish looks in written form, to the way in which texts circulate in Kurdish form. And then, as we can see, going a bit further on, there are just all of these novels and books of poetry that can be worked. So if we think in some way, a market can really develop for the creation and production and circulation of Kurdish works that functions in much the same way that you would have for Armenian or outside of the Soviet space in Turkey, in Iraq, with Turkish or Arabic works. That's not to say that there weren't processes in other countries where this also happened. So something that is unfortunately often buried is that in the 1960s, Iraq was actually quite an important center. Baghdad was an important center for standardization and production of Kurdish texts as well. So the 1960s, early 1970s, you have the University of Baghdad have a Kurdish faculty that produces magazines of Kurdish poetry and short stories and literary criticism. but it's so short-lived, it can't really compete with the way that Soviet Armenia was able to really pump out on a long-term scale well-known authors who described Kurdish realities, who described Kurdish traditions and their carryover into the Soviet period, um, and really spur this growth in a concept of a Kurdish literature that could function in, if not a capitalist setting, at least a socialist one or a Soviet one. So I think there's a really interesting part here where it's not just about the cultural expression and the creativity, but also about the economics
Mm.
of what Soviet Armenia allowed to occur. I mean, do you know in the 70s, 60s and 70s, some of these people went to North Kurdistan, to Diyarbakir, to Mardin, to Iraqi Kurdistan, and they met with intellectuals there. So they also passed this knowledge on to people who had been faced with incredible restrictions and oppression, and who wouldn't have had the opportunity to develop it in the same way.
I'm sorry, Michael. Did I hear you correctly? You said that these authors from Soviet Armenia went to North Kurdistan?
I
Diyarbakir?
believe I'd have to double check exactly on who went where, but I do know Hajia Jindi had traveled in other regions of Kurdistan as well.
Huh.
And I believe he might have gone, I think he might have gone to Iraq. And I don't know whether he went to Baghdad and the north or he just went to Baghdad. So I might have to have a question mark on that one, but I do know
No, no,
he
just
traveled.
it's quite interesting that they came, they went to other parts to somehow showcase their work, or somehow they were interested in spreading this message, right? So it's quite fascinating.
Yes, and they benefited from that, both from being Soviets, so passport-wise, they traveled as other Soviet citizens, and being anthropologists and ethnographers.
Hmm.
So they were not perceived as being politicians, and that allowed someone like Hajia Jindi to travel more freely.
Yeah, yeah. It's were these people, I mean, from a Kurdish institution. I mean, okay, we know that the Radio Erivan had a group of people collecting songs and so on and so on. But these authors, these writers, were they a part of an institution that they came together and wrote books and collected stories, or just random people who were interested in preserving Kurdish culture?
So in Soviet Armenia, they were definitely part of, I mean, everyone had to be part of some form of union. So they were part of the Union of Writers for Armenia if they lived in Armenia. There were some who lived in Soviet Georgia, so they were part of the Union of Authors in Soviet Georgia or in Azerbaijan. But then because they were a recognized minority in Soviet Armenia, there was also a separate union of writers for Kurdish writers in Soviet Armenia. And some of those institutions, while perhaps not the Writers' Union, don't necessarily survive today, there are still remnants of those cultural groups, formally recognized unions of cultural producers in Kurdish in Armenia even today. But in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, there were formal structures that allowed for these authors and poets to gather together to discuss and to disseminate their works through official channels, which both supported them and also was really the only way that you could do so in the Soviet system.
When I look at at these books and or poems, the title pages, the romanization is completely different. I mean, uh, for a person or Kurd who was raised in the Soviet Armenia and in the Soviet Union, so from Cyrillic, I mean, they romanize the Cyrillic uh, language. It looks very strange to me. Okay, so can you talk about this, and also codification uh,
Yes.
in Soviet Kurdish language codification in Soviet Armenia in the 20s, 30s, and 40s? You said.
So I think this is one of the reasons I find it so interesting looking at the Kurdish collections and Kurdish work. So before the Soviet Union, we know there are multiple traditions in Kurdish communities in terms of how they write, how they express themselves. So I'll just quickly switch over here. We have examples. This is one of the manuscripts, so it's Mamuzin, perhaps one of the most famous Kurdish works ever,
Mm,
by Ahmed Khani.
mm,
And this is written in Arabic script. So it's written in Arabic script, but it's not the Arabic script we know for Sorani today or used for Kurmanji in Syria. This is much like Ottoman Turkish. It's following largely the rules of Arabic um, and trying to grapple with the sound system for Kurdish. Christian Kurds or Christian speakers of Kurdish, if they were members of the Armenian Apostolic Church, might use Armenian letters to record Kurdish. Some who were part of the Syriac Orthodox Church might have used Syriac letters, so Garshuni. It's not, we don't necessarily see Kurdish in Latin script before the 1920s, but essentially Kurds write as they know, kind of forming their sentences and words as they see best fit based on the other languages they've learned. In the 1920s, Soviet Armenia begins by trying to encourage first the use of the Armenian script. So first saying, okay, there are all of these people who have moved into Soviet Armenia who are Kurdish speakers. First, because Armenia, their educational structures are using Armenian script. Let's get Kurdish speakers to do so first. But it lasts very short as a period. And in 1927, across the Soviet Union, all minority groups that don't already have an established alphabet are transferred to the Latin script. So here we can see this is the application of what's known as the uniform alphabet to Kurdish. So Hikyat Darhat Aysada, which of course would look very different using the Hawar system that Bedr Khan, Jalaluddin Bedr Khan created in the 1930s. And that's because this is a system of Latin alphabet where the same sound was meant to look the same way in Kurmanji, in Azeri, in Chechen, in Buryat, in Mongol.
mm.
And it lasted through the 1930s. So a number of books are produced in Kurdish in this script, and Kurds learn to write in it. So this is about the same time that in the 1930s, Bedir Khan is creating his Latin alphabet in Syria, and in Iraq, Sidqi is creating what is used 1920s, 1930s, what's used for Sorani today, for Central and Southern Kurdish.
I'm sorry, what did you say, Sitki?
Sidqi, so the creator of the Sorani, the Arabic script for Kurdish,
Mm.
where you have
Okay.
essentially one sign for every sound. But in the late 1930s, Stalin decides no, he doesn't want Latin to be used. All languages that use Latin now have to go on to Cyrillic. But unlike the Latin script, Stalin is very worried that the minorities will band together and will overthrow the Soviet Union. So every language has a very different script using Cyrillic. And by 1945, essentially we have the Cyrillic script that is used for Kurdish, for Kurmanji, instead of Latin script. So we can see here a few different examples where it looks very odd because so many letters are the same between the Hawar alphabet and the Cyrillic one, but essentially you have all of the same things marked between the two. So Karlene, so the E, which is over here, is like an E with a shapka on it. You have where you have the E here, which is the same E as in Russian, is with a hat on it as well. So it works pretty much the same way. And they just have to add in a few extra letters because there's no W in Russian. So there's a W added for Kurdish. Um, the P sound has to be added as well. So it's a process of just gradually swapping over. But what's different here is script and language are, of course, two distinct topics. And at the same time, they're gradually standardizing the language that is used. Now, Kurdish, because Kurdish is spoken over such a wide variety of places, the Kurdish that's spoken in Armenia is quite different from the Kurdish spoken in Ahmed, in Mardin, in Hawled. It is a Kurmanji dialect, so it is largely speaking comprehensible to someone from Ahmed or Mardin, but there are certain features that are different, and these features are also the product of all of these migrations. So there are all of these people coming from other areas who bring with them certain things. And one of them is that instead of having in as the izafe for the plural, so instead of having pirtukenmen, you'd have pirtuketmen with a D. And so features like that are almost standardized for Kurdish in Soviet Armenia, whereas in Mardin, in Kamishli, it would be standardized more as with an N. So there's a bit of a distinction between the two languages, or the two dialects, really, in terms of what becomes the standard. And it's only really in the 1990s when the Kurds in Armenia switched to the Hawar alphabet. So they now write the same way that Kurds in Ahmed and Mardin and Van and other places write. But some of the dialect features are still there.
Just for the viewers, when you say Hawar alphabet, you mean Hawar, the newspaper published in Syria by Badr Khan and other Kurdish intellectuals in the 30s, right?
Yes. So Badr Khan in the 1930s he has an Iraqi collaborator, but in 1932 he creates both Hawad as, it's a means of encouraging the spread of the alphabet as well. And it's an alphabet that's generally accepted by, many Kurmanji speakers and is employed. It's the one used in the north and somewhat in the West as well.
So I'm just really struck by your knowledge of the Kurdish language and literature. Just incredible. I'm so happy to have talked to you about that. Now, question is, what have changed? I mean, over the years, or changes and trends in the accessibility and recognition of Kurdish literature, for example, over the years in the world, or even the archival materials. So,
well, a few different things have changed, and I think some are definitely for the better, some are perhaps for the worse. One that's really changed is that the accessibility of Kurdish works has grown, or the publication even. So following the imposition of the no-fly zone in central Kurdistan, obviously in places like Hawled and Slimani, publishing industries could grow. So you have a sudden burst from the late 90s, early 2000s of publications in Sorani. You have some from Sanandaj as well. So from the Far East, which has meant that there's been a real growth of material. And then, especially from the early 2000s, although certain publishers have come under, attack from the Turkish state, Ahmed and Istanbul are now big centers for publishing in Kurdish. You get a bit of other places. Bingöl is one for Kurmanjki, and you have some in Izmir. Of course, Kurds find themselves in all different cities across Anatolia, but there's just this burst of publishing. So we as libraries can buy a lot more, we can offer a lot more, and there's just there are things in Kurdish about every topic. I can offer readers and researchers books about cinema studies, about gender, about history, about cuisine, about music in Kurdish, and you don't have to go to German or Turkish or Russian to learn about Kurds and their cultural production. You can read, in Kurds' own language, what their production is and how they want to express it and continue it. On the
So,
other hand, oh, sorry, go ahead.
no, no, no. Related to that, how would you raise interest in the libraries, the librarians to buy Kurdish materials? Uh, just please finish. I didn't want to interrupt you, but just related to that, when you said,
Well,
oh,
well, that was sort of my next point is that the problem, the sort of downside is that, for example, here in London, there used to be a program for learning Kurmanji at SOAS, at the School of Oriental and African Studies, part of the University of London. There used to be places where you could really study Kurdish and continue on. And although there is now, in fact, a program for Kurdish studies at Exeter University in the southwest of the country. It's really a struggle to be able to encourage the study of Kurdish. And I myself, to learn Kurdish, my ability to use Kurdish is limited very much to Kurmanji, and it's been based very much on written resources. Thankfully, the Enstitüya Kurdi in Istanbul produces wonderful books in order to learn Kurdish, but you really have to be very motivated, and that means that there isn't the demand for librarians to acquire the materials. And because of that, there isn't a growth in specialized understanding for many librarians as to how to find Kurdish material, how to catalog it, how to describe it, and how to promote it. So I think that while there is sometimes a burst of activity, part of the problem is that the skills to really interpret and to find and to grow Kurdish collections and their usage isn't, at least in the UK and in many parts of Western Europe, isn't there. So there's a lot more that has to be done to raise awareness. That thankfully the gap is filled a bit by the Kurdish library in Paris, and by the Kurdish library in Södertälje in Sweden. But we still have to get Kurdish materials integrated into larger collections so that students who come to study minority politics in Turkey will find Kurdish resources along with Turkish and Armenian and Arabic and Greek ones.
yeah, it's we had hosted the Kurdish novelist Burhan Sönmez. I don't know whether you know him or not, or
Oh, yes.
yes. So he has written many books, novels in Turkish. Okay, so but finally last year, 2024, he wrote a novel in Kurdish. Okay, and it's the title is Evindaren Franz K. The Lovers of Franz Kafka. So it was published by a Kurdish publisher in Diyarbakir. Okay, so I think that's a big contribution to the Kurdish literature. If someone follows Burhan Sönmez or interested in his works, then you can see, okay, finally he wrote something in Kurdish. Also, it raises interest in the Kurdish literature. So yeah, that's a great contribution too. So what are the problems or scholars and institutions encounter when researching or preserving Kurdish literary and historical documents? So in your case, for example, so in the case of British Library, okay, so or other institutions.
I think sometimes one problem is identifying works. So being able to look at materials and being able to say, oh, this is what language the work is in, this is who the author is, these are other works that we've had. So how to really describe it. Another one is trying to understand how, so for library professionals, how to really interpret the broader corpus of Kurdish cultural production. So in terms of things like, well, if you have something that is described as the work of a Dengbej, What does
Mm,
that mean? And here, what I'm talking about is that we, and I'm sure at your institution as well, at the law school library, um, we all use the Library of Congress's authority files for describing authors and subjects and titles. And those have to really be interpreted, because you might have poet, you might have singer, you might have author, um, but you have to understand, okay, well, what does this person do within the cultural context, and how am I going to describe them? And transfer it over to a universalist description. And that then transfers over to the researchers who might come in, and sometimes researchers come in, they say to me, oh, well, I tried finding things in Kurdish, but I couldn't find them. Or, I didn't think you had anything in Kurdish. And it's trying to educate readers and researchers what some of the tags are that we use. So I think actually Burhan Sönmez is a good example. We have things, that Mehmet Uzun is
mm.
another novelist who writes in both Turkish and in Kurdish. So if you get a novel of Mehmet Uzun in Turkish, how do you describe it? Is it Kurdish literature from Turkey in Turkish? Is it Turkish literature by a Kurd? Is it just Turkish literature from the 21st century? And so trying to weave in different ways of describing an author and describing their work so that someone who's coming in can find it and they can understand, given the political context of the Turkish Republic, authors might choose to write in both languages at different times. But they're part of a whole, they're part of a corpus. And so trying to explain to researchers as well, you might have to look a few different ways before you get that whole, because it can be very difficult to sew it all together.
Or Yaşar Kemal, for example, right?
Yes.
I mean, his book İnce Mehmet, it's actually content. The character is a Kurdish
Mhm.
character. Okay, so but it is regarded as Turkish literature. But once you know about the Kurds, once you know about Yaşar Kemal, his background, then but that process is so long, or there are so many steps until you get to know who Yaşar Kemal was, his works about actually as Kurdish theme. Okay, so I mean, I have watched a recording uh, of Yaşar Kemal with the Dangbeş. The Dangbeş sings a song of Meme Alan, okay, and the way he listens, okay, it takes the song takes him back to his early years in when he listened to Dangbejes when he was a kid or child, either in Van, because he was from Van, the Kurdish city of Van. Okay, so, but that is so lost. So, as you said, the um, the librarians actually have, I mean, in the Western world have to know about the Kurds in when they uh, catalog something, a word, for example, right? I mean, Burhan Sönmez, the same thing, or Mehmet Uzun. So you have to know, really have to have the knowledge of all the layers of uh, ethnic groups or societies in Turkey or in Kurdistan and so on to realize, okay, there are so many layers here. Yeah. My
And
last, yeah, go ahead.
oh, sorry, and I just wanted to pick up on that point because I think there's another aspect where, because of the way media, and perhaps I'll stop sharing my screen here. Um, um, so the way that Kurdish and non-Kurdish relations are often sort of formulated in North American or European media, there's often this idea there's a complete separation. But as you start to look at the cultural production of so many related peoples and neighboring peoples, I think it's also an idea of understanding that we have to encourage people to look at so many other works as well.
Yeah.
So most recently, reading there's a wonderful travelogue by Ansranik, who was an Armenian patriot. He was an Armenian general who fought for the Republic of Armenia in the first, well, after the First World War.
Mm, mm.
And he wrote a travelogue of the late 19th century going through Dersim.
Uh-huh.
It's recently been translated from Armenian into Turkish. So Aras Yayıncılık, which is an Armenian-themed publisher in Istanbul.
Yeah.
And it's a fascinating work because there he describes this incredibly close relationship between Armenians, and he describes either Alevis or Kurds.
Yeah.
I think Kurds sometimes might be Muslim Kurmanjki speakers, but he gives quite a few examples of the language that they speak. So he speaks Kurmanji, and he also speaks Kurmanjki, and he speaks Turkish and Armenian. And when they speak to each other, he gives examples of the language. And there, it's for someone to really understand, those works also have to come into the history of Kurds and Armenians, because as people who live together, they talk about each other. They talk about their lives together. They
Mhm.
talk about the cultural production of each other, of one another. And so really bringing that out and not relying on this narrative of, well, these people dislike those people and they don't live together and they won't, they don't recognize one another. There's so much there to really encourage a rich understanding of Kurdish history from all of the different ethnic groups and religious groups around where Kurds live.
Can you mention the title again, please?
So it's Dersim Seyahatnamesi,
Uh-huh.
uh, and it's Antranik is the author.
Okay. Okay. Uh, I just came across a beautiful, YouTube uh, recording, and this guy is trying to explain uh, the beats of a song, um, and the song is quite famous. I mean, well-known song, Haydar Haydar. Okay, and this guy is fascinated by the beats, and then he says Turkish, Turkish, Turkish, Turkish. I mean, Ali Ekber Çiçek is a famous uh, singer, famous performer, and his song Haydar Haydar is also quite famous song, but is a sacred Alevi Kurdish song actually, and he's from Erzincan. And but since the artists, the singers could not perform in Turkish, in Kurdish, and then everyone reverted to Turkish, right? I mean, so many uh, folk singers, they sing in Turkish, but everything is in Kurdish actually. But
Mhm.
it's this guy does not know anything about the Kurds or Kurdish Alevis, for example, right? I mean, uh, Ali Ekber Çiçek is quite famous Alevi. That is his expression, and the song is quite fascinating, and the rhythm is quite fascinating. Okay, but it's uh somehow it's reflected as a Turkish folk song. No, it's not. I wrote underneath under the YouTube channel, this is a Kurdish song, or this the performer is a Kurd and from the priestly family. So it's that song is being played at Kurdish Alevi ceremonies. Okay. So anyhow, so that was just it came to my mind when you mentioned that. So my last question is, what advice would you give to young researchers or Kurdish cultural advocates interested in contributing to this field?
And I'd say maybe one is and I think this goes for everything in life to really keep an open mind, that you might have to go through a few different hoops to find the materials that you're looking for, because that's what research is. And so don't give up on the first approach. If you don't find something, that you might have to think through a bit more creatively how to find it. And then the other thing that I'd really encourage everyone to do is, if you're working with someone at an archive, if you're working in an archive really, or a library, a memory institution, reach out to the curator, reach out to the cataloger, reach out to the people who are working there, and start a dialogue. Your research can be theoretical, it can be academic, but I think everyone wants to have a really practical aspect, a really practical impact to their research. And I'd say think of your use of the library or the archive as you go forward as being a way to make a positive impact by explaining what you're looking for, explaining what you find, explaining how there are difficulties, and trying to understand how you can work together with the people who are at the institution to really broaden the appeal and broaden the accessibility of Kurdish materials. I'm not an expert on Dengbej. I am not an expert on Kurdish music or on Kurdish cuisine, but it's through the conversations I've had with researchers who come in and who tell me what they're looking for, explain some of the issues they have with finding things, explain some of the outputs that they hope to have from the research, that then I really learn something about an aspect of Kurdish culture I didn't know before, and I can go forward, and as I acquire new materials, as I recatalog things, I can reflect that there. I can make it easier for next generations to find things. And when I say next generations of researchers, I don't just mean PhD students or master's students. I mean the Kurdish person who lives in North London who's curious about Kurdish cuisine because they want to cook it for their family. The
Mm.
Kurdish person who has listened to music and now wants to learn a bit more about the history of it. So it's a way to have a dialogue. The only way we can really encourage greater understanding of Kurdish culture and history is through engaging in that dialogue with one another and making it as open as possible to as many people as possible.
Michael, thank you very much. It's a beautiful conversation. Zor
Uh,
spa.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Malawi Avabe Yüksel. It was a wonderful opportunity. I'm very thankful to have the chance to speak with you.
Thank you.